Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine attacks targeting U.S. diplomatic offices in Europe and North America that were highly likely influenced by the ongoing conflict with Iran. We also look at a joint U.S.-Ecuador anti-cartel operation near the Colombian border, and the implications of reports that Haitian security forces have killed civilians in drone strikes targeting gangs. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we assess Ukraine's counterattacks in the south and their potential impact on Russia's planned spring offensive. We also examine the appointment of Mojtaba Khamenei as Iran's new supreme leader, the continued Iranian attacks across the Gulf, Israel's mobilisation of ground forces along the Lebanon border, the worsening security environment in the Sahel, and rising protest risks in Guinea ahead of the May parliamentary elections. And in Asia-Pacific, we analyse the evolving conflict between Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban and the potential long-term security implications for Pakistan. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where attacks and sabotage have targeted U.S. diplomatic offices abroad amid the ongoing conflict with Iran. On the night of March 7th to 8th, an improvised explosive device detonated outside the U.S. Embassy in Oslo. The blast caused minor damage to the building, but there were no casualties. Norwegian authorities noted that, around the same time as the explosion, a video praising Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was posted on the embassy's Google page. On March 11th, Norwegian authorities arrested 3 individuals of Iraqi origin in connection with the bombing. Earlier, on March 10th, the U.S. consulate in Toronto was targeted by small arms fire. Canadian authorities reported that occupants of a passing vehicle opened fire on the building. The attack caused minor damage and no injuries. Alongside attacks targeting U.S. diplomatic offices, incidents were also recorded at Jewish places of worship. On the night of March 8th to 9th, an explosion occurred outside a synagogue in Liège, Belgium. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The timing of the attacks, along with the publication of a video praising the Ayatollah, who was killed by U.S. and Israeli strikes in the opening stages of the Iran conflict, suggests it is highly likely that these attacks are linked to the ongoing hostilities in the Middle East. In the last 5 years, Iranian intelligence services have intensified what are often described as hybrid operations targeting adversarial states, including in Europe and North America. In mid-2025, Swedish authorities reported that Iranian intelligence had enlisted local, small, organized criminal groups to carry out attacks against Israeli targets. The same authorities also linked Tehran to 2 shootings in October 2024, which targeted the Israeli embassies in Stockholm and Copenhagen. In the United Kingdom, intelligence and security services have warned of an increasing number of Iranian-linked plots targeting Israeli, Jewish, and dissident figures. In these cases, Tehran has increasingly relied on proxy actors and criminal networks to conduct operations abroad, while maintaining a high degree of plausible deniability. In the United States, several Iranian plots have also been disrupted. These include an alleged plan to assassinate President Trump, as well as other high-ranking U.S. officials. The alleged Iranian use of local criminals to carry out hybrid operations at the behest of Tehran closely resembles a model long associated with Russia. Moscow has also financed local criminal groups, disenfranchised individuals, or political extremists to conduct operations in countries it considers hostile to its interests, typically in exchange for payment. However, Iran may also be able to leverage its extensive diaspora community, as well as sympathetic individuals and pre-existing militant networks, to facilitate or carry out attacks. While the overwhelming majority of the Iranian diaspora is opposed to the regime, its estimated size, between 4 and 6 million people, and its wide geographical spread will likely provide Tehran with opportunities to identify, recruit, or even coerce individuals capable of supporting its covert activities. The attacks on the 2 U.S. diplomatic offices match patterns seen in previous alleged Iran-sponsored operations. This includes the use of relatively unsophisticated methods and the decision to carry out the attacks at night, which was likely intended to reduce the likelihood of the perpetrators being arrested. However, as the conflict continues and Iran's risk threshold increases, there is a realistic possibility that Tehran, or Iranian-aligned actors, will conduct more complex or higher-impact attacks targeting U.S. and Israeli interests, as well as the international Jewish community. Still in the Americas, U.S. and Ecuadorian forces have carried out a joint operation targeting cartel networks near the Colombian border. On March 6, U.S. Southern Command officials stated that U.S. and Ecuadorian forces had carried out an operation aimed at dismantling narco-terrorist networks in the Ecuadorian province of Sucumbíos near the Colombian border. Ecuadorian President Daniel Noboa stated that the operation targeted elements of the Comandos de la Frontera, a splinter group of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. As of March 12, U.S. or Ecuadorian authorities had not specified whether the operation, which involved airstrikes, resulted in any militants being killed or arrested. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The strike almost certainly marks a significant development in U.S. anti-cartel operations. It appears to be the first recorded U.S. strike on cartel positions on land during the current administration. Moreover, the operation was carried out with direct support from Ecuador. Previous U.S. strikes on cartel vessels in South and Central American waters were conducted unilaterally, often provoking rebukes from regional powers. Cooperation with the host nation government almost certainly offers several advantages to Washington. These include a lower political cost for its anti-cartel operations, as well as the ability to leverage local resources and bases, helping to avoid prolonged and costly regional deployments. Operations will also likely benefit from stronger on-the-ground intelligence sources. On the day following the strike, March 7th, U.S. President Donald Trump announced the Shield of the Americas, a coalition of 13 countries from across the Americas with the stated mission of using lethal military force against cartels operating in the region. Many of the countries that joined the coalition are led by recently elected right-wing leaders who have pledged to implement a mano dura, or iron fist, approach to organized crime, modeled on El Salvador's controversial policies. Notably, several major regional players were absent from the summit, including Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. All 3 states are governed by left-wing parties, and their leaders have repeatedly rebuked Washington for conducting unilateral security operations and for infringing on national sovereignty. Joint U.S. and host nation military operations in Latin America are likely to push cartel activity into neighboring states where cooperation with the U.S. is weaker or absent altogether. This dynamic has been observed before and is often referred to as the balloon effect. It leads to the displacement of trafficking routes, production sites, and militant activity into adjacent jurisdictions. For example, intensified operations in Ecuador are likely to push some activity into Colombia. There, competition between rival groups or factions may result in an increase in localized violence. Also in the region, a new report has revealed that drone strikes by Haitian security forces have killed more than 1,000 people, including civilians. On March 10th, the non-governmental organization Human Rights Watch published a report stating that at least 1,243 people were killed in drone strikes across 141 operations between March 1st, 2025 and January 21st, 2026. According to HRW, at least 43 adults who were not members of criminal groups, along with 17 children, were killed in the operations. The strikes were carried out by Haitian security forces and private contractors. The report found no widespread use of drones by gangs. In some instances, explosives-laden quadcopter drones were used in densely populated areas. At least some of the strikes were reportedly deliberate extrajudicial killings. The drone attacks have significantly increased in recent months. Nearly twice as many strikes were recorded between November and late January as between August and October. The UN Integrated Office in Haiti has attributed the attacks to a specialized task force supported by a US-based private military company. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Gang violence has been the primary factor shaping Haiti's threat environment in recent years. In 2025, gang violence was responsible for at least 6,000 deaths and the displacement of more than 1.4 million people. Around 90% of Port-au-Prince is now controlled by gangs. These groups have evolved from fragmented organizations carrying out sporadic acts of violence into larger criminal coalitions with established territorial control. The killing of civilians is highly likely because anti-gang drone strikes have been carried out in and around Port-au-Prince, where gang members operate among homes, alleyways, and densely populated informal settlements. Many gangs are embedded within civilian communities and operate directly from populated neighborhoods. Furthermore, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance used to support targeting highly likely relies on low-confidence target identification, with inadequate distinction between gang members and bystanders. The killing of civilians will highly likely benefit the gangs by alienating Haitians from the government. This will make communities less willing to provide information to security forces that could be used against gang networks. As a result, the quality of human intelligence received by Haitian security forces is likely to deteriorate, further exacerbating the risk of civilian deaths. This alienation is also highly likely to benefit gang recruitment. Gangs can present themselves as protectors of local communities, claiming to defend the population from government forces. Following the publication of the Human Rights Watch report, the Haitian government is highly likely to face increased scrutiny over its anti-gang methods from the United Nations, donor governments, and human rights organizations. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where Ukrainian counterattacks in the south are likely complicating Russia's preparations for a spring offensive. During a March 6th visit to the Donetsk front, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia was preparing a spring offensive in the sector. However, Russia has recently redeployed elements of the relatively elite 76th VDV Division, along with naval infantry, from the Pokrovsk and Dobropilya axes in Donetsk Oblast to the Orikhiv-Hulyai-Polypolohy sector in Zaporizhzhia Oblast. This move follows recent Ukrainian gains in Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts after a series of limited counteroffensives. Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence stated on March 7th that a 3-month defensive operation by the Timur Special Unit had halted the Russian advance towards Zaporizhzhia. According to the GUR, the operation killed or seriously wounded more than 300 Russian personnel, captured 39, and degraded Russian logistics sufficiently to force a scaling back of assault activity. On March 10th, international media reported that Major General Oleksandr Komarenko said Ukrainian counterattacks had pushed Russian troops out of more than 400 square kilometers along the southeastern Dnipropetrovsk axis. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. It is likely that Ukraine's counterattacks in Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts have already imposed a tangible operational cost on Russia. These operations have likely forced Russian forces to redeploy relatively elite formations away from the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya axis. This axis is highly likely intended to be the focal point of Russian offensive operations once winter conditions and the spring mud season end, and ground conditions subsequently improve. Moscow highly likely ultimately intends to envelop the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, which remains the central component of Ukraine's remaining fortress belt in Donetsk Oblast. There is a realistic possibility that, if Russian ground momentum remains constrained in the south, Moscow will compensate with more frequent long-range strikes against urban areas, transport nodes, and critical infrastructure deeper inside Ukraine. Ukraine's recent gains therefore likely improve its ability to disrupt Russian ground offensive plans. However, they do not materially reduce the immediate threat environment for civilian movement, commercial operations, or foreign personnel elsewhere in Ukraine. Staying in the region, Iran has appointed Mojtaba Khamenei as the country's new supreme leader, following the killing of his father earlier in the conflict. On March 8, the Iranian Assembly of Experts announced that Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed in US and Israeli strikes on February 28, had been selected to succeed his father as supreme leader. According to available reports, Mojtaba was also targeted during the opening phases of the conflict and suffered undisclosed injuries. Mojtaba's appointment comes amid severe pressure from US and Israeli forces on the main pillars supporting the Iranian regime. Having already degraded much of Iran's air defense capability, US and Israeli forces have reportedly intensified strikes against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as well as the Basij civilian militia. On March 11th, Allied missiles reportedly destroyed the digital security center of Sepa Bank in Tehran, the state-owned bank responsible for paying government staff salaries. On March 12th, reports emerged that much of the surviving Iranian leadership may have relocated to Mashhad, near Iran's eastern border with Turkmenistan. Iranian forces have intensified strikes on vessels in the Strait of Hormuz and, according to US channels, have begun mining the area to prevent oil tankers and military vessels from transiting. At least 6 vessels have been attacked by Iranian forces, including 2 incidents between March 11th and March 12th. US forces have conducted several operations aimed at degrading Iran's ability to block the Strait of Hormuz, including strikes on 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The appointment of Mojtaba Khamenei as the new supreme leader almost certainly represents a victory for the IRGC and other hardline political elements within the regime. It is also likely a setback for the moderate faction associated with President Masoud Pezeshkian. Tensions between these factions over the conduct of the war had already emerged on the eve of Mojtaba's appointment. Pezeshkian's apology to the Gulf states for Iranian strikes was publicly rebuked by channels linked to the IRGC and by other hardline officials. The new supreme leader lacks military experience and is reportedly injured. As a result, he is unlikely to personally direct Iran's offensive operations, which will almost certainly fall under the effective control of the IRGC. Moreover, Mojtaba's appointment has likely enabled the IRGC to consolidate political power, reducing the chances of an immediate ceasefire with the United States or Israel. Iran's long-range offensive capabilities, those able to target Israel, regional US forces, and Gulf states, alongside military systems capable of holding US and Israeli assets at risk, almost certainly remain the primary high-value targets for combined strikes. However, the volume of Iranian missile and UAV attacks has significantly decreased. Ballistic missile launches have dropped by more than 90%, likely reflecting both degradation of capabilities and deliberate conservation. Israeli channels claim that approximately 80% of Iran's ballistic missile transporter Erector launchers have been destroyed. Moreover, US Central Command has stated that most of Iran's best air defense systems are no longer significant factors in mission planning for air operations. This has likely given US and Israeli air forces greater freedom of movement, as well as more operational space to conduct strikes deeper inside the country. The decrease in Iran's long-range offensive capabilities, together with the near-complete securing of air superiority, has likely enabled a gradual shift towards increased strikes on the organizations and institutions that allow the Iranian regime to function and maintain authority. Strikes on the IRGC, Basij militias, police stations, and other state institutions have increased. These attacks are almost certainly intended to degrade the regime's internal security apparatus, weaken its ability to maintain domestic control, and increase pressure on the Iranian leadership. In Iranian Kurdistan, US and Israeli strikes have targeted multiple IRGC and Basij bases, along with border guard and police checkpoints and stations. These strikes are likely intended to undermine the regime's control in the region and encourage a Kurdish rebellion, which could potentially spread to other parts of Iran. The strike on Sepabank is almost certainly indicative of this evolving approach. Sepabank is a state-run institution largely responsible for paying the salaries of government employees, including members of the IRGC and Iran's conventional military, the Artesh. The strike was therefore likely designed to disrupt the regime's ability to finance and sustain its security apparatus, delay or interrupt salary payments, and demoralize state employees. Further combined strikes against state-run financial institutions or other organizations that support the regime are likely. However, such attacks are also likely to provoke Iranian retaliation. On March 11th, IRGC-linked media threatened attacks on financial institutions across the Middle East. Due to the significant degradation of its offensive capabilities, the need to conserve ammunition, and the increased threat of regime collapse, Iranian forces have likely intensified efforts to maximize the cost of the conflict. Iran has already targeted regional critical national infrastructure and has stated that it would abandon its previous policy of reciprocal hits. Tehran has also warned that it may target US businesses. In addition, Iranian officials have threatened to close the strategic choke point of the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply typically transits. Iranian attempts to block the Strait of Hormuz have so far been limited, although some naval mines have been laid. This has likely been intended to signal Tehran's ability to disrupt global energy flows while preserving the option to escalate further, without fully closing the waterway and halting Iran's own crude exports, which still depend on transit through the strait. However, the presence of mines, combined with threats to harass or even sink commercial shipping, has already caused significant disruption to maritime traffic. It has increased costs and forced Gulf states to redirect exports through alternative routes and pipelines where possible, in order to mitigate disruption to global oil supplies. Across the Gulf, Iranian missile and drone attacks have continued to target critical infrastructure and commercial hubs. Iranian strikes in the Gulf have continued to cause material damage to civilian profile facilities, including residential locations and critical national infrastructure. Targets have increasingly included oil and gas facilities, power generation plants, water desalination facilities, airports, ports, hotels and offices owned by regional governments. As of March 11th, Iranian attacks across the Gulf have resulted in at least 6 deaths and dozens of injuries in Kuwait, 2 deaths and dozens injured in Bahrain, 16 injuries in Qatar, 6 killed and 122 injured in the UAE, 1 killed and 5 injured in Oman, and 2 reported deaths with 12 injured in Saudi Arabia. Many of these casualties have resulted from falling debris following successful interceptions rather than from direct strikes. While Iran's rate of ballistic missile launches has decreased by more than 90%. Since the start of the conflict, the vast majority of those missiles are being intercepted by regional air defense systems. Iran's unmanned aerial vehicle attacks have also declined, although they remain frequent enough to pose a credible threat. For example, between March 1st and March 8th, Iran conducted more than 100 UAV attacks targeting the UAE each day. However, between March 9th and March 11th, Iranian UAV attacks against the UAE did not exceed 39 per day. On March 11th, a spokesman for the Khatam al-Anbiya headquarters, the unified command headquarters of the Iranian armed forces, declared that US and Israel-linked economic centers and banks would now be targeted. He warned that people of the region should not be within a 1-kilometer radius of banks. Tasnim News Agency, a media outlet associated with Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, also published a list of potential targets. These included private US companies operating in the Middle East. The list named offices belonging to major technology firms such as Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Nvidia, located in both the Gulf states and Israel. The agency also issued threats against banks and financial institutions across the region. In response, Citibank, Deloitte, and Standard Chartered have evacuated their offices in Dubai. HSBC has closed its Qatar branch, and PwC has temporarily shut multiple offices across the Middle East. Iranian attacks have prompted the UN Security Council to pass a resolution demanding that Iran halt its egregious attacks on its Gulf neighbors. The resolution stated that Iran's strikes are in breach of international law and pose a serious threat to international peace and security. China and Russia, both considered close partners of Iran, abstained from the vote, allowing the resolution to pass without either country using its veto to block it. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The marked decrease in Iranian ballistic missile launches almost certainly reflects both the high rate of expenditure and the success of joint US-Israeli strikes, which have prioritized the targeting of Iran's ballistic missile launchers and supporting infrastructure. However, missile barrages targeting the Gulf states are likely to continue in the immediate term, albeit at a reduced frequency and scale. This approach would allow Iran to conserve its remaining ballistic missile inventory while still maintaining pressure on the Gulf states and forcing them to expend expensive and limited air defense munitions. While Iran's UAV attacks have also diminished, this is likely primarily the result of operational conservation. Before the conflict, Iran was assessed to possess between 80,000 and 100,000 one-way attack UAVs in its inventory. Iran is also likely capable of manufacturing these systems at high rates, even under wartime conditions. These UAVs are relatively cheap and simple to produce. Prior to the war, estimates suggested that Iran could manufacture as many as 400 Shahed one-way attack UAVs per day. Even if its manufacturing facilities, stockpiles, and launch systems have been significantly degraded by combined strikes, Iran may still be able to sustain daily UAV attacks across the Gulf numbering in the hundreds. In the long term, this dynamic is likely to result in critical shortages of air defense munitions. Iran is therefore likely to adapt its attack patterns to exploit vulnerabilities in regional air defense networks, refining its targeting to maximize the effectiveness of its strikes. Iran's drone tactics have likely already improved after several days of sustained UAV attacks. There is also credible reporting that Russia is providing Tehran with intelligence and is assisting Iran in applying advanced UAV tactics developed during the war in Ukraine. The credibility of the threats issued by KACHQ and Tasnim towards US companies and financial institutions in the Middle East remains uncertain. However, the warning follows previous attacks targeting facilities owned by Amazon, and several US and international firms have already implemented contingency measures in response. Even if the threat ultimately proves not to be credible, it is still likely to produce tangible effects. At the strategic level, the warning has likely undermined the Middle East's reputation as a secure commercial hub and may encourage host nations to place pressure on Washington. At the tactical level, the threat could force Gulf states to reposition air defense systems to improve coverage around major commercial centers such as Dubai. This in turn could create gaps elsewhere in national air defense networks, potentially enabling Iran to more effectively target critical national infrastructure or U.S. regional bases. Also in the region, Israel has deployed multiple divisions to southern Lebanon, signaling preparations for a potential large-scale offensive against Hezbollah. The Israel Defense Forces has intensified its strikes across Lebanon and issued evacuation orders affecting an estimated 800,000 people following missile fire from Hezbollah. These evacuation orders have included the southern suburbs of Beirut, where Hezbollah maintains significant influence. On March 11th, the IDF instructed residents of 6 southern suburbs of Beirut to evacuate until further notice. The orders affected approximately 500,000 people in the capital and triggered the mass evacuation of the area. As of March 11th, the Israeli Air Force is estimated to have conducted more than 200 airstrikes in Beirut alone since February 28th. While most strikes have focused on the southern suburbs, airstrikes have also targeted parts of central Beirut. On March 8th, an Israeli strike hit the Ramada Hotel in the Roush district of central Beirut, resulting in 4 deaths and 10 injuries. According to the IDF, those killed were members of Iran's Quds Force, the external operations arm of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. On March 12th, an IDF double-tap strike hit the Ramlet al-Baida seafront area of Beirut, where many displaced Lebanese civilians have sought shelter. Neither of these locations had been included in the previously issued evacuation orders. In southern Lebanon, IDF strikes have markedly increased, and ground operations have expanded alongside the air campaign. The IDF has deployed 3 divisions across southern Lebanon. The 91st Division is operating along the eastern sector of the Israel-Lebanon border. The 210th Division is deployed around the Mount Dov Shibar Farms area, and the 146th Division is positioned in the western coastal sector of southern Lebanon. In addition, the elite Golani Brigade has been redeployed from the Gaza Strip to reinforce Israel's northern command and support operations along the Lebanon front. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The deployment of 3 divisions and the Golani Brigade is highly likely an early indication that the IDF is preparing to expand ground operations in southern Lebanon. All 3 divisions are combined arms formations capable of conducting coordinated maneuver operations that integrate armor, infantry, artillery, and combat engineering units. The current positioning and composition of these forces likely indicate that the IDF intends to conduct coordinated operations across the eastern, central, and western sectors of southern Lebanon. The objective would likely be to degrade Hezbollah's military capabilities and establish a larger buffer zone along the international border. Israel's main objective is likely to push Hezbollah's military capabilities north of the Litani River, in line with United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701. Achieving this objective would degrade the Hezbollah threat to northern Israel by increasing the distance between Hezbollah rocket launch sites and Israeli population centers, and by limiting the group's ability to conduct cross-border attacks. However, in the short term, the threat to northern Israel has likely increased significantly. During previous escalations between Iran and Israel or the United States, Hezbollah largely refrained from directly targeting Israel. This restraint almost certainly reflected the group's degradation following sustained IDF operations after the October 7th attacks. However, the joint Israeli and U.S. strikes inside Iran and the killing of Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei were almost certainly a red line for Hezbollah. This shift is likely reflected in recent statements by Hezbollah's Secretary General Naim Qassem, who pledged allegiance to Iran's new Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei and reaffirmed Hezbollah's readiness to confront Israel. Hezbollah's involvement has already resulted in sustained rocket and mortar attacks on northern Israel and on IDF military positions along the Lebanon border. The group has also conducted missile strikes targeting locations deeper inside Israel, including Haifa and military installations near Tel Aviv. These attacks follow warnings from Israel's security establishment that Hezbollah could expand its rocket campaign and begin striking deeper into Israeli territory, including what officials described as significant facilities. IDF operations in southern Lebanon will almost certainly be supported by air power, including strikes on high-value targets in Hezbollah's rear areas and in parts of Lebanon where the group maintains strong influence, such as southern Beirut or the Bekaa Valley. However, central Beirut and other locations not covered by IDF evacuation orders will also likely be targeted when intelligence indicates the presence of HVTs. Multiple reports indicate that elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have been deployed to Lebanon and are coordinating attacks with Hezbollah's senior leadership. IRGC personnel will almost certainly constitute high-value targets for the IDF. As a result, the IDF will likely strike targets of opportunity regardless of their location within Lebanon, as demonstrated by the strike on the Ramada Hotel. In Africa, militant groups have intensified attacks across the Sahel, targeting airports, military convoys, and key infrastructure. On the night of March 8th to March 9th, fighters from Islamic State Sahel province attacked Tahua Airport in the city of Tahua in western Niger. The airport hosts the Nigerian state's fleet of 4 Turkish-manufactured Bayraktar TB2 drones, which Nigerian forces regularly deploy against militant groups in the country. The attack resulted in the complete destruction of 2 drones and an unspecified number of casualties. Less than a month earlier, ISSP fighters also attacked Niamey's airport. Also on March 9th, the al-Qaeda-affiliated Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin reportedly carried out a large-scale ambush against a column of Malian armed forces and Russian Africa Corps troops in the Ségou region of Mali. At least 5 Russian operatives were reportedly killed. The ambush marks the costliest defeat suffered by the Africa Corps since the beginning of 2026. It also occurred amid the continuing fuel blockade in Mali, which JNIM has maintained since September 2025. On March 10th, fighters from the Azawad Liberation Front carried out an attack against Gao Airport in northern Mali, as well as positions held by the Malian Armed Forces and the Russian Africa Corps. The assault reportedly involved the use of around 25 suicide drones, which overwhelmed Africa Corps air defenses and damaged several aircraft at the airport. The strike represents the first reported use of a drone swarm by the FLA and is unprecedented in its level of sophistication. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The security situation in the Sahel deteriorated significantly throughout 2025. The 3 junta-led states that make up the alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, continue to face multiple insurgent groups, including both Islamic State affiliates and Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin. The AES has aligned itself closely with Russia. The Sahel juntas have expelled Western forces and instead strengthened defense partnerships with the Russian Ministry of Defense-controlled Africa Corps, previously known as the Wagner Group. Cooperation agreements between the AES and the Africa Corps are largely predicated on expanding Russian control over mineral resource extraction and processing sectors. While Russian support has enabled the juntas to consolidate control over key urban centers, the past 18 months have seen repeated large-scale attacks by militant groups. These include the July 2024 Battle of Tinzawatan, the August 2024 Barcelogo massacre, the September 2024 attack on Bamako Airport, the March 2025 Diapaga raid, and the recent attacks in Niamey, Gao, and Tahua. Such incidents have damaged the morale of AES forces and pushed the juntas to concentrate their key assets in capital cities and around major mining towns. The attack on Gao almost certainly demonstrates how militant groups in the region are adopting increasingly sophisticated weapon systems. In some cases, they are now fielding capabilities that rival the combined firepower of local militaries and the Afrika Korps. In 2026, the notable losses suffered by AES governments have been followed by renewed attempts to engage with Western states. In late January 2026, Malian diplomatic officials organized their first high-level summit with U.S. counterparts since the 2023 coup, which had sharply worsened relations between Bamako and Washington. As of early March, local media have reported that Mali is preparing to allow U.S. forces to resume aerial reconnaissance flights. On March 10th, Burkinabe and American diplomatic officials also announced bilateral talks in a movie similar to Mali's outreach. The moves by Bamako and Ouagadougou have a realistic possibility of indicating growing dissatisfaction among AES states with the limitations of Russia's capabilities as a security provider. They could therefore be followed by further rapprochement between the Sahel juntas and Western states, particularly in the area of security cooperation. And in West Africa, tensions are rising in Guinea after the dissolution of 40 opposition parties ahead of the May parliamentary elections, a move that could trigger major protests. On February 6th, Guinea's Ministry of Territorial Administration and Decentralization issued a decree ordering the closure of the headquarters and local offices of 40 political parties. The parties' assets have reportedly been confiscated and all offices sealed. According to the MATD, the parties failed to comply with legal requirements, including the submission of mandatory financial statements. Several of the dissolved parties have rejected these allegations. Opposition leader Chello Dalein Diallo of the Union of Democratic Forces of Guinea, who is currently in exile, released a video on social media declaring that direct resistance is now the only remaining path to change. He added that the head of the junta and his malevolent clique want to rewrite the country's history by erasing from the political landscape all forces likely to overshadow his nascent one-party state. As of March 12th, he had not yet formally organized protests. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Guinean politics is marred by pervasive corruption. Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index ranks the country 133rd out of 180. The Guinean military junta carried out a coup in September 2021, claiming it was acting to end corruption and poor governance. Since then, anti-corruption measures have frequently been used to target opposition and civil society figures, many of whom have been arrested and brought before the courts. Despite winning the December 2025 presidential election and formally transitioning to civilian rule after the 2021 coup, the dissolution of opposition parties almost certainly reflects the continuation of President Mamadi Doumbouya's increasingly authoritarian rule. There is a realistic possibility that Diallo will call for mass protests against Doumbouya's government. The risk will almost certainly increase as the May 2026 parliamentary elections approach. Opposition parties and civil society organizations have continued to organize periodic demonstrations, despite the junta's ban on protests imposed in 2022. After the Guinean military junta postponed the elections in December 2024, demonstrations erupted. The protests were met with a crackdown by security forces that left one protester dead during clashes and led to the arrest of hundreds of mostly young people. Previous cycles of unrest in Guinea have included large marches and stay-at-home strikes. They have also featured road barricades, the burning of tires, and violent clashes with security forces. The protests of 2019 to 2020 resulted in at least 50 deaths and around 200 injuries. A further estimated 27 people were killed during post-election unrest in October 2020. Political instability has also historically exacerbated ethnic tensions, with different ethnic groups often aligning themselves with competing political factions. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, Pakistan's military operations against the Afghan Taliban continue, with Islamabad likely retaining the ability to dictate the tempo of the conflict. Between March 5th and March 12th, clashes between Pakistan and Afghanistan continued across the Afghan regions of Paktia, Paktika, Khost, and Kandahar, as well as Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan provinces. The conflict, which Pakistani officials have openly described as a war, has so far resulted, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, in the displacement of at least 115,000 people in Afghanistan and 3,000 in Pakistan. Other UN reporting indicates that around 200 civilians have been killed in the conflict. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Pakistani forces retain a significant technological and operational advantage over the Taliban, and are likely dictating the pace and tempo of the conflict. Islamabad's stated objective remains the dismantling of Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, also known as the Pakistani Taliban, and the severing of its links with Kabul. To achieve this, Pakistani forces are concentrating most of their strikes near the Durand Line, aiming to prevent cross-border Taliban operations without committing large numbers of ground forces. Despite its military superiority, Pakistan has several vulnerabilities that make it unlikely to seek a protracted conflict or further escalation. TTP cells almost certainly retain the ability to carry out attacks against state, civilian, and military targets across Pakistan. In addition, the diversion of security resources to confront Afghanistan and the TTP is likely to create openings for other militant groups, including Baloch separatist forces and Islamist organizations such as Islamic State, to increase their recruitment and attack activity inside Pakistan. Baloch separatist groups are also likely to benefit from the ongoing conflict in Iran, which is likely contributing to instability in Iranian Balochistan, with potential spillover effects for Pakistan's own Balochistan region. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.